kept my hands perfectly still on the edge of the leather chair as my mother cheerfully poured champagne for the man who abandoned our engagement 2 years ago. But 2 hours later, when he was staring at a state-certified document that turned his 9-figure real estate project into useless dirt, I smiled and slid a $4,000 dinner bill across the table to my parents. My name is Harper. I am 30 years old, and I run an environmental consulting firm in the Colorado Rockies. Before I tell you how I used a dead man's handwriting to dismantle a corporate ambush at my own birthday dinner, tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. If you believe people who set traps usually end up catching themselves. The light from a single candle fractured through a crystal water glass just as Ashley let out a bright, rehearsed laugh. I stepped through the heavy oak door of the private dining room, bringing the bitter Denver chill in with me. Carter was turned toward my mother mid-story, his fingers loose around a glass of bourbon. Then he saw me. The laugh stopped. That half-second of silence hanging over the white linen is where the story starts. I had driven through the first hard freeze of November, expecting a quiet 30th birthday dinner with my parents Diego and Elena. Instead, I was looking at my ex-fiance and the woman he left me for, seated at my table as if they belonged there. I did not gasp. I did not turn around and walk back out into the freezing wind. Because 6 weeks ago, a cousin sent me a single text message. They are planning something for your birthday, and Carter is involved. I had been getting ready for this room ever since. I pulled out my chair and set my leather bag against the table leg where I could reach it. Inside sat a single sealed envelope in my grandfather's careful block handwriting that I had not yet let myself open. My mother rose, smoothing her silk blouse, and kissed my cheek. Her heavy floral perfume could not hide the tension radiating off her. Carter has such exciting news, she beamed. It just made sense to celebrate everyone together. I smiled back. In my family, cruelty never raises its voice. It arrives dressed as hospitality. I already knew roughly what they wanted from me. What none of them knew was that I stopped needing their approval somewhere in the last 6 weeks. I just had not proven it to myself yet. That was the only thing left uncertain tonight. Not whether I would win, but whether I could do the difficult thing waiting in my bag and still walk out whole. The light from a single taper candle fractured through a crystal water glass just as Ashley let out a bright and highly rehearsed laugh. I stepped through the heavy oak door of the private dining room and brought the bitter Denver chill in with me. Carter was turned toward my mother, and he was right in the middle of a story. His fingers rested loosely around a low-ball glass of expensive bourbon. Then he saw me standing in the doorway. The laugh stopped instantly. That half-second of heavy and suffocating silence hanging over the white linen tablecloth is exactly where this story begins. My name is Harper Rodriguez, and today is my 30th birthday. Outside the frosted windows of the restaurant, Denver is enduring the first hard freeze of November. It is the kind of biting cold that sweeps down from the Front Range and glazes the city streets in a dangerous layer of ice. I drove through that winter weather, expecting a quiet and private dinner with my parents Diego and Elena. I had dressed for a simple family milestone. Instead, I am standing on the threshold of a catered trap. I am looking directly at the man who called off our engagement 2 years ago and the woman he left me for. They are seated at my table as if they have every right to belong there. I do not gasp. I do not turn around and walk back out into the freezing wind. I do not give any of them the satisfaction of a visible flinch. My heart does not even race because I am not surprised. 6 weeks ago, my cousin sent me a single cryptic text message while I was reviewing soil reports at my office. The message said they are planning something for your birthday, and Carter is involved. You need to be careful. I have been preparing for the geography of this specific room ever since that notification illuminated my screen. I step forward and pull out the heavy upholstered chair opposite them. I set my worn leather tote bag against the leg of the table where my hand can easily brush its surface. Inside that bag sits a single sealed envelope. The front bears my name written in my grandfather's careful and slanted handwriting. I have carried it with me for a month and a half, and I have refused to open it until the exact hour required it. My mother rises from her seat, and her silk blouse rustles softly in the quiet room. She leans over the table to kiss my cheek, and her heavy floral perfume fails to mask the dense tension radiating off her skin. "Harper, darling." She beams, and her voice is pitched with a counterfeit delight that instantly sets my teeth on edge. Carter has such exciting news to share with us. It just made sense to celebrate everyone together tonight. I smile back at her. It is a terrifyingly serene smile. In my family, cruelty never raises its voice. It never throws a glass or pounds a fist against a table. Cruelty arrives dressed in tailored clothes. It offers a toast, and it weaponizes hospitality to ensure you cannot defend yourself without looking unhinged. If I raise my voice, I am the hysterical ex-girlfriend. If I leave, I am the bitter and jealous daughter ruining a lovely evening. I already know the shape of what they want from me tonight. I have spent my entire adult life mapping the depths of my parents' ambition. I have tracked how easily they trade loyalty for access to the right social circles and the right investment opportunities. What none of them understand as they look at me over their artisan appetizers is that a fundamental shift occurred inside my chest 6 weeks ago. The daughter who needed their validation does not occupy this chair anymore. The woman who would have swallowed the bitter taste of an ex-fiance crashing her milestone birthday just to keep the peace no longer exists. I stopped needing their approval the day I learned they were negotiating my future behind my back. I just have not proven it to myself yet. That is the only thing left uncertain tonight. I am not wondering whether I will win this silent war. I am wondering whether I have the spine to do the difficult and irreversible thing waiting in my bag and still walk out of this restaurant whole. Ashley shifts in her seat and smooths the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. She looks at me with a gaze that is perfectly calibrated to project pity. "Happy birthday, Harper," she says, and her tone is thick with artificial sweetness. "We were so thrilled when your parents said you would not mind us joining. Carter and I have just been dying to share our updates with the people who matter most." She places her hand over Carter's, and he gives her a tight, approving smile. 2 years ago, Carter sat in my living room and told me that my career running a local environmental compliance firm was holding him back. He said my ambitions were too small for the life he was building as a luxury commercial developer. My parents did not comfort me when he walked out the door. They apologized to him. They kept him in their social circle, and they continued to orbit his wealth. They treated my heartbreak as a temporary inconvenience to their networking schedule. They have always viewed my quiet and methodical life in the mountains as a failure to launch. They did not realize that while they were busy curating their social media presence at charity galas hosted by Carter, I was busy reading the public filings for his real estate acquisitions. I know exactly why he is sitting across from me sipping top-shelf bourbon, and it has nothing to do with celebrating my birth. My father Diego clears his throat and signals the waiter to pour the sparkling water. Diego operates under the assumption that he is the smartest man in any room he enters. He treats conversations like boardroom negotiations, and he views his children as assets to be leveraged. He adjusts his expensive watch and gives me a broad and patronizing grin. "We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, Harper," he says. The waiter steps away, and the heavy silence returns to our corner of the room. I let my hand drop to my side, and my fingertips trace the edge of my leather bag. The envelope inside feels like an anchor tethering me to reality. My grandfather was the only person in this family who ever looked at me and saw someone worth protecting. He was a man who understood the value of deep roots and quiet resilience. He left me something profound when he died, and my parents have resented it ever since. They see his legacy as a financial stepping stone. They view the earth itself as a commodity to be traded for a better zip code. I take a slow sip of my water and let the cold liquid steady my pulse. The waiter places leather-bound menus in front of us, and I do not even glance at the prices. I know my father intends to use his credit card tonight to assert his dominance and create a sense of obligation. He wants me to feel grateful for the meal, so I will be agreeable to the pitch. He believes a few expensive steaks and a generous pour of wine will buy my compliance. Carter leans back in his chair and studies me. He is searching for a crack in my composure. He expects me to look down at my plate or make a passive-aggressive comment. He expects the woman he discarded to shrink under the weight of his new success and his new relationship. I do not shrink. I meet his gaze evenly, and I hold it until he is the one who has to look away and pretend to study the wine list. This is the moment the dynamic in the room shifts, but they are too arrogant to notice it. They have built an elaborate trap based on a version of me from 2 years ago. They are relying on my fear of conflict and my desire for parental affection to bind my hands. They brought an audience to ensure my silence. They think the shame of seeing Carter happy will make me sign whatever document they slide across the table just to end the humiliation. I watch my mother reach for a piece of artisan bread, and I feel a profound and quiet grief wash over me. It is not grief for Carter. It is grief for the fact that these are the people who raised me, and I already know what I'm about to do tonight will permanently sever my ties to them. The real tragedy is not that my ex is at my birthday dinner. The tragedy is that my parents invited him. But the grief does not weaken me. It clarifies my purpose. I sit up a little straighter in my chair. I keep my voice pleasant and entirely devoid of emotion. "Well, Carter," I say, and I watch his eyes snap back to mine. "Mom said you have exciting news. I would love to hear what brings you out on such a cold night." The trap is set, and I have just politely asked them to step onto the trigger. The waiter approaches our table with a quiet grace and distributes heavy leather-bound wine lists. I open mine while my mother continues her endless stream of pleasantries about the upcoming winter gala season. My eyes scan past the overpriced Cabernets and land on a specific Bordeaux. The vintage is 2010. That single 4-digit number halts my breath for a fraction of a second. 2010 was the year my grandfather took me up to the high Rockies during a bitter whiteout. He knelt in the knee-deep snow and dug his bare hands into the freezing earth beneath a towering spruce. He brought a handful of dark dirt up to my face and taught me how to read a soil sample by its scent alone. He said, "Rich earth smells like crushed leaves and old iron." He owned 50 acres of that raw, magnificent terrain. I let that sensory memory sit heavy in my chest while my mother leans across the white linen to praise Ashley for her immaculate posture. The land my grandfather loved was never the pristine wilderness my parents imagined when they fantasized about mountain estates. When he died, the parcel he left behind was a bureaucratic nightmare. It carried years of delinquent property taxes that threatened immediate auction. It sat under a mountain of municipal fines stemming from a commercial logging tenant who had broken his lease and dumped equipment and chemical runoff across the southern ridge. My parents took one look at the legal notices from the county clerk and declared the inheritance a reckless money pit. They refused to invest a single dime to save their own father's legacy. They signed away their rights without a second thought, so I took the title alone. I put the deed in my own name to shield the property from the state. For 7 long years, I spent every spare dollar my small environmental consulting firm generated to clear those inherited debts. I spent my weekends hauling rusted scrap metal out of the steep ravines. I stood in the freezing dark, taking water samples from the creek to satisfy the county compliance board. I restored the native pine habitats by hand and learned the contour of every ridge. My parents never once asked how I managed to keep the property from foreclosure. They ignored the dirt under my fingernails and the deep exhaustion shadowing my eyes. They assumed the land was just sitting there gathering weeds because acknowledging my hard work would mean admitting their own neglect. I listened to Ashley compliment the sleek interior design of the restaurant, and I realize exactly why I tolerate this agonizing charade. I have operated under a quiet and punishing belief my entire adult life. I have internalized the idea that my only true worth to this family lies in protecting them silently, regardless of the heavy cost to my own sanity. I have absorbed their snide remarks and their blatant disappointment without uttering a single word of defense. I believed that being the dependable and invisible shield was my fundamental duty as a daughter. It is the reason I endure my mother fawning over the man who shattered my heart. It is the reason my fingers keep drifting down to brush the edge of my leather bag instead of reaching inside to rip open my grandfather's sealed envelope. I have always prioritized their comfort over my own dignity. I have bought their conditional affection with my silent suffering. But sitting across from Carter and his new girlfriend, I feel that old familiar reflex starting to rot from the inside out. The urge to shrink myself to make the room easier for them is fading. I am tired of being the collateral damage in their pursuit of social status. I stare at my mother as she laughs at a joke Carter just told. She looks at him with more warmth than she has ever directed at me. She is willing to serve me to him on a silver platter if it means securing her place in his wealthy orbit. My father rests his elbows on the table and shifts his posture. He clears his throat and slips effortlessly into his practiced boardroom cadence. He uses the exact tone he reserves for closing corporate acquisitions and intimidating junior executives. He thinks he is guiding the conversation naturally, but I understand his strategy with chilling clarity. The exciting news my mother teased earlier is not a simple life update. It is a calculated pitch. My family has fundamentally miscalculated my existence. They have mistaken my quiet life in the mountains for a small and uninformed life. They assume that because I do not attend their charity galas, I do not understand how their world operates. But wealthy developers must file public intent notices before they break ground. I read municipal zoning filings for a living. I know Carter builds luxury alpine resorts designed to attract out-of-state billionaires. I know a sprawling mountain resort requires robust commercial water rights and heavy machinery access roads to satisfy the State Planning Commission. Without a clear path for construction vehicles and a guaranteed water supply, a development project is nothing more than a drawing on a piece of paper. And I know there is exactly one private parcel in that specific regional corridor that controls both of those vital resources, the 50 acres I spent my 20s saving. The trap they have constructed is tightening around my chair before the villains even speak their demands. They invited me here to corner me. They brought Carter and Ashley to fluster me and make me feel small. They believe the sheer awkwardness of the social dynamic will force me to agree to whatever terms they present just to escape the dinner. They think shame is a leash they can use to drag me into compliance. I look at Carter as he confidently adjusts his expensive cuffs. He radiates the arrogant certainty of a man who believes he holds all the winning cards. He thinks I am still the heartbroken girl he left behind 2 years ago. He expects me to be overwhelmed by his presence. Carter reaches beside his plate and rests his hand on a sleek presentation folder. It is printed on thick, expensive cardstock and bound with a subtle texture. I let my gaze drop to the bottom right corner of that dark folder. Stamped into the material is a small and unassuming silver logo. Summit Peak Capital. I stare at those 3 words and all the ambient noise in the restaurant seems to evaporate. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation from the surrounding tables fade into a distant static. I do not blink. I go entirely still in my chair. I do not ask Carter what the logo means. I do not demand an explanation from my father about the financing. I keep my expression as placid and unreadable as a frozen lake. I know exactly who Summit Peak Capital is, and I know precisely how their strict underwriting division operates. The magnitude of Carter's oversight is staggering. He walked into this restaurant expecting an easy victory over a naive ex-girlfriend. He thought he could bypass standard due diligence because he was dealing with family. He has no idea what he brought to my table tonight. I pull my hand away from my leather bag and rest it on the cool linen cloth. I lean back in my chair and wait for them to initiate their own destruction. The waiter arrives with a tray of perfectly plated Wagyu beef tartare and sets it gently down before each of us. As soon as the server steps away from the table, my father makes his move. He picks up the sleek presentation folder branded with the Summit Peak Capital logo and pushes it across the white linen directly toward my plate. The heavy cardstock slides silently over the cloth until it bumps against the base of my water glass. He moves the document with the practiced and aggressive fluidity of a senior partner presenting a hostile merger agreement. There is a fundamental truth about this transaction that my father has intentionally obscured. He does not hold a single legal right to the property in question. My parents abandoned their claim to my grandfather's estate years ago when the tax burdens appeared too steep. My name and my name alone sits on the registered county deed. They possess zero legal authority to compel a sale or authorize a transfer of the land. They cannot forge my signature or override my ownership through a municipal loophole. Their entire strategy tonight relies entirely on emotional manipulation. They have no legal leverage, so they have weaponized social shame instead. They intentionally orchestrated a high-pressure environment designed to paralyze me. They seated me across from the man who broke my heart and the woman who replaced me, and then surrounded me with the overwhelming expectation of familial duty. They banked on the calculation that I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene in a luxury restaurant, and too intimidated by the combined weight of their arrogance to refuse. They built a room to make declining the offer feel socially and emotionally impossible. Carter is orchestrating a massive development project right on the Breckenridge border, my father says, leaning forward to ensure his voice carries the full weight of his presumed authority. It is an incredibly lucrative opportunity for everyone involved, but the municipal planners require a secondary access road for the heavy construction vehicles, and they need dedicated water rights before they approve the final zoning permits. He taps his index finger against the top of the dark folder. He needs your 50 acres to finalize the corridor. Your mother and I have already assured him that you would be thrilled to sell the parcel to assist the project. We want to wrap this up tonight ideally so he can move forward without delays. He brought all the necessary transfer paperwork with him. Just look at it as a family legacy partnership, Harper. It is a chance for you to finally contribute to something substantial. The sheer audacity of his phrasing hangs in the air above the tartar. A family legacy partnership. He is asking me to liquidate the only piece of my grandfather I have left to facilitate a commercial payout for my ex-fiance, and he is packaging the theft as an act of familial solidarity. Right on cue, Ashley leans across the table and rests her manicured hand gently on Carter's forearm. She tilts her head and offers me a smile that drips with synthetic warmth. It really is a fantastic project, Harper, she says, her voice pitched to convey a cloying sense of intimacy. Carter is so passionate about elevating the mountain communities. And honestly, that sensible wool sweater you are wearing is just so charming, but imagine what you could do with a real financial windfall. She pauses to let the insult regarding my clothing settle before she twists the knife deeper. We are actually finalizing the blueprints for the custom home Carter is building for us near the new resort site. It is going to have floor-to-ceiling windows facing the peaks and a massive wraparound deck. We are just so blessed that everything is falling into place perfectly. I know you must be so happy to help Carter achieve this dream. Her performance is practically flawless. She plays the role of the gracious and slightly oblivious victor with absolute precision. She is intentionally flaunting the life I was supposed to have and reminding me of my discarded status. She wants me to feel small and inadequate. She wants me to shrink back into my chair and quietly sign the papers to escape her condescending pity. I do not interrupt her monologue. I do not snap back or defend my wardrobe. I let her play out the entire obnoxious scene without offering a single word of resistance, because arrogant and complacent enemies always make fatal mistakes when they believe they are winning. I look at the folder resting against my water glass, and then I look at my father. I keep my expression remarkably placid and my voice as mild as milk. This seems like a very sudden development, I say softly. If Carter has been planning a project on the Breckenridge border for months, why is there such an urgent rush to sign the transfer documents tonight over dinner? My father chuckles and exchanges a knowing and conspiratorial look with my mother. He assumes my gentle question is simply a request for reassurance before I capitulate. Well, Harper business moves fast in the commercial sector, he explains, waving his hand dismissively. Carter has investors lined up who want to see forward momentum, and frankly, it benefits your mother and me if we expedite the process. He straightens his tie and smiles like a man who has already cashed a lottery ticket. Carter has generously included a rather substantial finder's fee for us for brokering the introduction and securing the land. It is enough capital to finally purchase that ski-in ski-out condo in Vail your mother has been wanting for the last 5 years. It is a win for everybody. My mother beams at me across the table and clasps her hands together under her chin. She looks at me as if they have just offered me a tremendous gift. She expects me to be overjoyed that my sacrifice will fund her luxury vacations. The arithmetic of their demand is utterly obscene. They are asking me to surrender my only inheritance. They are demanding I sacrifice the privacy of the mountain sanctuary I rebuilt with my own exhausted hands. They expect me to hand over the dirt my dead grandfather loved to a man who humiliated me, and they are trading all of that away so they can collect a finder's fee to buy a second vacation home. They threw my personal humiliation into the transaction for free because they do not believe my dignity possesses any market value. But here is the fundamental error at the core of their entire grand strategy. They have drastically miscalculated the person sitting in this chair. They firmly believe I am still the struggling and naive 20-something that Carter dumped 2 years ago. They remember a girl who cried into her pillow and frantically signed whatever financial documents her father placed in front of her to avoid an argument. They think my silence over the past few years was evidence of stagnation and lingering heartbreak. They do not realize that the girl who sought their approval died a long time ago in the freezing mud of the high Rockies while saving that land. They built this entire elaborate evening and staked a massive commercial real estate deal on a woman who no longer exists. I look down at the sleek pen resting beside the presentation folder. I do not reach for it. I do not even touch the heavy cardstock. Instead, I smoothly reach past the paperwork and pick up the leather-bound wine list the sommelier left near the centerpiece. Since we are all celebrating such monumental family milestones tonight, I say, keeping my tone bright and accommodating, let us make sure we celebrate properly. I open the menu and run my finger down the highest-priced column. I will take the 2010 Bordeaux, please. My mother gasps softly and her eyes widen with a mixture of shock and profound hope. She knows exactly how expensive that particular bottle is. It costs exactly $4,000. She looks at my father and then back at me, and I can see the gears turning in her head. She reads my extravagant order as a clear signal of surrender. She interprets my willingness to order a luxury item as proof that the tension is softening into cooperation. She thinks I am treating myself to a final expensive reward before I sign over the deed and accept my defeat. That is exactly what I want her to believe. I want them to feel completely secure in their impending victory. I want them to relax their guard and revel in their perceived dominance. The decoy has officially begun, and they have swallowed the bait whole. The waiter arrives with the decanter and the bottle of vintage Bordeaux cradled carefully in his arm. He pours a small tasting measure into my wide crystal glass. I lift the stem and swirl the dark ruby liquid, letting the aroma of crushed berries and aged oak fill the space between us. It smells like deep earth and long winters. I give the sommelier a brief nod, and he proceeds to decant the rest of the expensive wine. The dark liquid cascading into the glass vessel serves as a quiet hourglass for the performance I am about to deliver. My family and my ex-fiance are waiting for me to surrender, and I am going to give them the exact show they set this table to see. I reach my hand out across the pristine white linen, and I pick up the designer pen Carter left resting beside the sleek presentation folder. The pen is crafted from heavy, polished metal, and it feels cold against my skin. I turn it over slowly between my fingers, feeling its deliberate weight. I lower my gaze to the cover of the document. I allow my shoulders to slump forward just a fraction of an inch. It is a microscopic shift in posture, but it is the universal body language of a woman conceding defeat. I let the silence stretch out until the anticipation in the room becomes a physical presence. When I finally speak, I force my vocal cords to tighten. I make my voice sound thin and hesitant, like a person standing on the edge of a great height and looking down. What is the actual buyout number, I ask, looking at the tablecloth instead of meeting their eyes. I make sure my tone carries a fragile tremor. I need to know what my grandfather's legacy is worth to you. My father leans forward in his chair instantly. He senses the kill, and he is eager to play the role of the magnanimous victor. He unbuttons his suit jacket to project an air of relaxed benevolence. He names a figure that is undeniably large, but still a steep discount for commercial acreage with prime water access. He assures me that the offer is exceedingly fair, and that I will be set up for a very comfortable future. He speaks to me using the slow and soothing cadence one might use to coax a frightened animal out of a corner. I nod slowly and continue turning the heavy pen over and over in my hands. I trace the smooth metal barrel with my thumb. If I do this, I say, letting my voice waver even more, will you at least put a plaque somewhere on the property, something near the main lodge or the hiking trails? I just want my grandfather's name to remain on the land he loved. It does not have to be large. Just something so people know who kept the trees alive all these years. I blink, and I intentionally let a single tear gather in the corner of my right eye. I hold it there by sheer force of will. I do not let it fall down my cheek. The teardrop simply rests on my lower lash line and catches the flickering amber light of the taper candle burning in the center of the table. To every single person sitting in this dining room, I am a broken woman, being gently and inevitably walked toward her own capitulation. The reaction is instantaneous and entirely predictable. The predators at the table lean in to inspect their captured prey. Carter relaxes his posture and leans back against his upholstered chair. A smug and self-satisfied smirk creeps onto his face. He is basking in the glow of a man who believes he has read the room with perfect accuracy. He thinks he has successfully intimidated me into signing away my birthright. Ashley reaches over and gives his bicep a firm and victorious squeeze. Her eyes dart toward the folder with undisguised greed. Across the table, my mother exhales a long and shuddering breath. I watch her shoulders drop as the tightly coiled tension leaves her body. She takes a sip of her sparkling water, and her eyes shine with profound relief. The uncomfortable social friction she feared has evaporated, and her path to a luxury ski condo is now seemingly clear of any obstacles. But the truth of this moment is a secret kept entirely within my own mind. The tear glistening in my eye is aimed with lethal precision. The fragile questions about plaques and buyout numbers are load-bearing pillars supporting an elaborate trap. The hesitation is nothing but bait cast into dark water. We are operating under a veil of heavy dramatic irony. They believe they are burying me, but they are merely grabbing the shovels I handed them and digging their own graves delicious and slow. Yet beneath the calculated theater of my trembling hands, there is one genuine element that makes the performance flawless. The manufactured emotion works because it is anchored to a bedrock of very real and very raw devastation. Underneath the tactical facade, a part of me is genuinely grieving right now. I am not mourning the loss of Carter. His departure from my life was a blessing wrapped in a temporary tragedy. I am grieving for the fact that the two people smiling at me across this table are my parents. I look at my mother and my father celebrating my engineered defeat, and I know with absolute certainty what I must do to protect my grandfather's land. I know that the actions I'm about to take will cost me my family forever. The tear holding steady in my eye is fueled by the agonizing realization that the unconditional love I always craved from them never actually existed. I am mourning the death of an illusion. I am saying goodbye to the hope that they might one day value me more than their social status. That profound and authentic sorrow is what makes my decoy so convincing. It is not all theater. The heartbreak is real, even if the surrender is fake. I take a slow, stabilizing breath, and I set the designer pen down on the white linen tablecloth. I place it right next to the presentation folder. I do not push the paperwork away from me, but I also do not sign my name on the dotted line. I leave the documents exactly where they are resting in the space between compliance and refusal. I look up and meet Carter's eyes. I let the fragile persona linger on my features for just a moment longer. "Let me hear the whole vision first," I say softly, keeping my tone compliant and inquisitive. It is a huge undertaking to build a resort of that scale in the high Rockies. The infrastructure alone must cost a fortune. Who is providing the capital funding for such an enormous project? The bait is placed perfectly on the hook, and Carter is far too arrogant to resist an audience. He cannot pass up an opportunity to boast about his professional prowess in front of his new girlfriend and my awestruck parents. He sits up straight and smooths the lapels of his tailored jacket. He wants to impress me with the sheer scale of his empire. He opens his mouth and he tells me the name of his primary financial backer. He lists the corporate entity financing his grand mountain resort. And in telling me that name, he smiles and willingly hands me the pin to his own grenade. Carter leans back in his upholstered chair and adjusts his stiff cuffs with a practiced flick of his wrists. He looks around the private dining room as if he already owns the building and everyone inside it. "Summit Peak Capital," he says. The words roll off his tongue with a deep and satisfying reverence. They hold the mezzanine debt for the entire commercial development. They are the best in the business when it comes to backing luxury alpine infrastructure. The day I have this deed secured, they release the second tranche of funding, and we break ground before the spring thaw. I nod slowly. I let the name of the financial firm hang in the quiet space between us. Summit Peak Capital. It is the exact same name corresponding to the subtle silver logo I spotted on the bottom corner of his presentation folder just a few moments ago. I remain perfectly still in my chair. My breathing is shallow and tightly controlled. I let my absolute stillness communicate to the room that the name matters, but I do not spell out why it matters. Not yet. I just watch him bask in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. Carter is a man who builds his life on the assumption that other people exist simply to facilitate his upward ascent. He is not an incompetent developer. It would be a massive mistake to assume he is stupid. He is highly educated and ruthlessly efficient in his commercial real estate dealings. His fatal flaw is not a lack of intelligence. His primary defect is a profound and blinding arrogance coupled with an overwhelming rush to finalize his vanity projects. He takes a long sip of his premium bourbon and smiles warmly at my father. My father nods in vigorous agreement with his former prospective son-in-law. We wanted to move quickly to get the financing locked in before the end of the fiscal year, my father adds. Carter was brilliant to bypass the usual bureaucratic red tape and handle this directly. Carter chuckles and gestures toward the thick folder sitting on the table. I did not waste time or capital on a full title pull, he brags. Corporate due diligence takes weeks and costs an absolute fortune in legal fees. I told my investors that family deals close on a handshake. We keep things in-house, and we keep things incredibly clean. He did not verify these ownership records because he made a fatal assumption about the people sitting at this table. He assumed a jilted ex-girlfriend and 2 status-hungry parents were a guaranteed transaction. He looked at my parents and saw 2 people desperate enough for a luxury payout that they would eagerly handle the messy emotional work of forcing my compliance. He looked at me and saw nothing but a weak and malleable target. His error is born entirely of contempt. It is a specific and targeted contempt for me. He believes I am so desperate for affection and so eager to please my family that I will sign away a fortune just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation at dinner. That deep-seated arrogance is the exact blind spot that has allowed him to walk directly into the snare. I keep my hands folded in my lap and maintain my carefully crafted expression of fragile curiosity. That sounds incredibly complicated, I say, keeping my voice low and soft. When exactly does the second tranche of funding get released? I want to make sure I'm not holding up your timeline or causing any issues with the investors. Carter leans forward and rests his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. He is eager to explain the mechanics of his triumph to a woman he assumes cannot possibly comprehend high finance. Tomorrow morning, he says with total confidence, the bank has everything queued up on their end. Once I scan over the signed deed tonight and attach the lender's environmental compliance sign off the wire, transfer initiates automatically. He says the phrase environmental compliance the way a man says a word he has never actually had to worry about. He waves his hand dismissively as if the strict ecological regulations of the Colorado Rocky Mountains are nothing more than a minor administrative nuisance. He treats the protection of the land as a simple box to check on a vast corporate spreadsheet. I feel the second hammer of the trap lock firmly into position. The gun is fully loaded and ready. But I do not fire it. I do not point out the monumental error in his timeline. I let the silence absorb his arrogant declaration. I let him continue to believe he is the smartest person in the room. Internally, the foundation of the lie I have lived by for my entire adult life is beginning to crack and splinter. For years, I would have swallowed this exact type of humiliation. I would have picked up the designer pen and signed the documents to protect everyone else from the fallout of their own terrible choices. I would have sacrificed my grandfather's legacy to buy my parents a temporary reprieve from their financial insecurity. I would have found the quiet and graceful exit, allowing them to celebrate their victory, while I walked out into the cold with absolutely nothing. Tonight, listening to Carter narrate the expansion of his empire, using my stolen inheritance as the cornerstone, I feel the old familiar reflex surging in my chest. Keep the peace, Harper. Keep protecting them. Do not cause a scene. Do not embarrass your family in a luxury restaurant. But as those familiar commands echo in my mind, I feel something else rising alongside them. For the very first time, I feel the crushing weight of what that lifelong reflex has actually cost me. It has cost me my boundaries and my self-respect. It has allowed the people who are supposed to love me to view my loyalty as an endless and exploitable resource. They do not cherish my quiet sacrifices. They simply factor my obedience into their business models. The leather bag resting against my chair leg feels heavier than a block of solid lead. The sealed envelope inside it calls to me. I still have not opened it. I have carried my grandfather's final words for 6 weeks, waiting for the courage to read them. I realize now that my hesitation was not about fear of the past. It was about the terrifying responsibility of the future. Opening that envelope means stepping out of the obedient role my parents assigned to me. It means becoming a woman who defends her own ground, even if she has to stand entirely alone to do it. The heavy oak door to the private dining room swings open, and the sommelier returns. He carries the bottle of 2010 Bordeaux and a wide crystal decanter on a polished silver tray. The ritual of decanting the wine demands the attention of the entire table. The sommelier moves with practiced elegance, pouring the dark ruby liquid so it breathes and opens up after years of sitting in a dark cellar. The rich aroma of damp earth and aged fruit fills the enclosed space. It is a scent that reminds me of deep pine forests and cold mountain air. Ashley watches the wine with wide and covetous eyes. She has clearly calculated the price per glass in her head, and she is practically vibrating with the thrill of consuming such an extravagant luxury. Carter looks immensely satisfied. He believes my expensive order is my way of blessing his monumental real estate deal. My mother watches the dark liquid swirl in the crystal vessel, and her posture softens completely. She thinks the tense negotiation is over, and the celebration has officially begun. My father Diego reaches his hand out and wraps his fingers around the stem of his water glass. He clears his throat loudly, signaling that he requires the absolute attention of the room. He pushes his shoulders back and sits up perfectly straight. I watch him prepare his features into a mask of benevolent paternal pride. I realize with a cold and crystalline certainty that he is about to deliver a toast. He is going to raise a glass to my surrender before the wine has even been poured. My father stands up slowly, ensuring the movement commands the attention of every person seated at the table. He picks up a heavy silver spoon and taps it gently against the rim of his crystal water glass. The sharp, high-pitched clinking cuts through the low murmur of the private dining room. Through the partially open French doors, I see patrons at the neighboring tables pause their conversations and glance over, drawn by the sound of a formal declaration. This is the true midpoint of the evening. It is the absolute point of no return. I stay seated perfectly still, and I let the villains cross the threshold first. To family, Diego booms, his voice resonating with an entirely unearned sense of pride. He projects his words outward so that everyone within earshot can witness his grand benevolence, to letting go of the past and building something truly prosperous for the future. He raises his glass toward the man who shattered my engagement and humiliated me 2 years ago. Carter, he says, his tone dripping with corporate camaraderie, we are absolutely thrilled to partner with you on this monumental endeavor. It is an honor to have you back in our circle. He then turns his gaze toward me. He shifts his posture to embody the role of the loving and supportive patriarch. He offers me a smile that is both public and profoundly patronizing. And Harper, he continues, his voice softening into a counterfeit warmth, we are so incredibly proud of you tonight. We are proud of you for looking at the big picture and finally making the mature and realistic choice. You are doing a wonderful thing for this family. Ashley claps her hands together lightly, a delicate and polite sound that feels like sandpaper against my skin. My mother leans into my father's arm, and her eyes shine with genuine, unadulterated joy. She is looking at me as if I have just won an award, when in reality, they are toasting my absolute surrender. They are raising expensive crystal in an upscale Denver restaurant to celebrate the complete erasure of my grandfather's pristine mountain legacy, all so they can upgrade their seasonal ski passes and secure a luxury condo. The elaborate decoy I constructed has done its work flawlessly. They have marched all the way out onto the very end of the thinnest branch, and they are sawing away at the wood, happily entirely blind to the sheer drop below them. I do not interrupt him. I let the arrogant toast breathe in the quiet air of the room. I wait while my father brings the crystal rim to his lips and takes a long, triumphant drink of the water. I allow the neighboring tables to witness his grand moment of victory, because in just a few minutes, those same witnesses will be present for the rest of the performance. When my father lowers his glass, the expectant silence returns to the table. Everyone is waiting for me to smile, to nod, and to finally pick up the designer pen to sign away the deed. Instead, I stand up. I push my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping softly against the carpet. I stand tall and straight, and I do not reach for my water glass or the newly poured Bordeaux. I do not raise anything in return to his toast. The self-satisfied smiles around the table falter almost instantly. My mother's shining eyes narrow with sudden uncertainty. Carter shifts his weight in his chair, his relaxed posture stiffening as he tries to read my blank expression. Ashley lowers her clapping hands and glances nervously at her boyfriend. The script they wrote for this evening has just hit an unpredicted snag, and none of them know how to improvise. I do not reach for the sleek presentation folder. I reach down to the side of my chair and open the brass clasp of my worn leather bag. It would be very easy in this moment to aggressively whip out a stack of notarized legal documents and slam them onto the white linen. It would be satisfying to throw the aggressive paperwork in their faces immediately. But I do not reach for the municipal filings or the environmental compliance notices. I reach past the cold, hard leverage. I make the necessary emotional turn. I pull out the small, sealed envelope. The paper is slightly yellowed and feels soft at the edges from being handled. Across the front, my name is written in my grandfather's careful, slanted block letters. Harper. I have carried this envelope unopened for 6 agonizing weeks. I kept it sealed because I knew that the moment I opened it, I would have to admit the undeniable truth to myself. Opening this letter meant accepting that the parents sitting across from me would never choose me over their social ambitions. It meant accepting that protecting my grandfather's land would require me to permanently destroy my relationship with the people who raised me. I kept it sealed to protect the last fragile shreds of the lie I had lived by. I stand at the table and I look at the envelope. I slide my thumbnail under the flap, and I break the seal right there in front of them. I pull out a single sheet of lined paper. There is no lengthy explanation, no complicated legal directive, and no sprawling farewell. There is only one single line written in dark blue ink. It is written in Spanish. It is the exact phrase he spoke to me all those years ago when he placed that freezing handful of dark earth into my palm and taught me how to read the soil. La tierra no se vende, se cuida. I hold the paper and I read the sentence aloud. My voice is steady and clear, and it carries the profound weight of the man who wrote it. The land is not sold. I translate, looking directly into my father's eyes. It is cared for. I gently place the single sheet of paper down on the white tablecloth. I do not slide it toward my parents. I place it directly on top of Carter's sleek presentation folder, completely covering the Silver Summit Peak Capital logo. The private dining room goes utterly terrifyingly quiet. The ambient noise from the main restaurant seems to vanish entirely. My mother's face undergoes a drastic and immediate transformation. The warm, radiant joy drains from her features, replaced by a tight, pale mask of genuine apprehension. She recognizes the handwriting. She recognizes the quote. And she finally realizes that the daughter she thought she had successfully manipulated is not the woman standing at this table. I look at the letter resting on top of the corporate buyout contract, and a deep, unshakable calm settles into my chest. The fear that has gripped me for 6 weeks evaporates into the crisp Denver air. I look at my family and my ex-fiance, and I finally know with absolute certainty that I can do this. Thank you for the wonderful toast, Dad, I say, keeping my voice at a low and conversational volume. My tone is almost gentle, entirely lacking the hysterical anger they prepared themselves to manage. And thank you, Carter, for the generous offer. It is a very impressive presentation. However, I will not be signing the transfer deed. Not tonight. Not ever. I let those 2 short sentences land heavily on the white linen tablecloth. I do not rush to explain myself. I watch the absolute shock register on their faces. My father blinks rapidly, his mind struggling to process a refusal he deemed impossible. My mother touches her throat, her manicured fingers pressing against her pearl necklace as if checking her own pulse. Carter leans forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looks at me like a malfunctioning piece of machinery he cannot figure out how to restart. I wait for the reality of my refusal to settle over the room before I provide the explanation, because the explanation itself is the retribution. The punishment I have designed is built to perfectly mirror the specific nature of their crime against me. They conspired to convert my grandfather's sacred land into liquid currency. They wanted to pave over his memory so they could fund their social climbing. So I took the necessary legal steps to transform that land into something that money can never touch again. I reach back into my worn leather bag and bypass the remaining emotional artifacts. I pull out a thick stack of heavy legal paper bound by a heavy brass staple. The front page bears the embossed gold seal of the state of Colorado. I slide the document smoothly across the table until it rests right next to the handwritten letter. This is a finalized and state-certified conservation easement, I state, clearly ensuring my enunciation is pristine. 3 weeks ago, I quietly and legally transferred the commercial development rights of all 50 acres directly to the Colorado Land Trust in perpetuity. The transfer is irreversible. That specific parcel of land can never be commercially logged. It can never be paved over for infrastructure. It can never be utilized for commercial building projects. Ever. I reach forward and turn to the second page of the heavy document, tapping my finger against a specific highlighted paragraph. There is a minor provision included in the trust agreement that I insisted upon, I say, and I allow a small measure of genuine satisfaction to enter my voice. It is a memorial designation. The protected land will forever bear my grandfather's name on the public registry. I look at Carter and watch his arrogant confidence shatter into a million jagged pieces. So the heavy machinery access road you need to build your resort is physically and legally impossible, I explain calmly. Furthermore, the water rights attached to the property cannot be severed or diverted for commercial hospitality use under the terms of the trust. The dirt you are sitting here trying to purchase tonight is legally and permanently useless to any commercial developer. Ashley's mouth falls open in a perfect silent circle of disbelief. The charming facade she wore all evening evaporates, leaving behind a look of profound and unfiltered panic. She stares at the gold seal on the document as if it were a venomous snake resting next to her water glass. Carter goes entirely white. The healthy flush of his expensive ski weekend vanishes, leaving his skin the color of old ash. He lunges forward and grabs the heavy document, his hands actually shaking. He flips frantically through the dense legal jargon, his eyes darting across the paragraphs as he desperately scans for a loophole or a termination clause he can exploit. He is searching for a mistake that does not exist. "You are wasting your time, Carter," I say, leaning back in my chair and watching his frantic panic. The trust is ironclad, and you should already know that. A conservation easement is a matter of public record. It was officially filed with the county clerk 3 weeks ago. Any standard and competent title pull would have flagged the encumbrance immediately. I let the weight of his monumental professional failure crush the remaining air out of his lungs. But you bragged earlier that you did not want to waste time or capital on due diligence. You assumed that a jilted ex-fiance and 2 status-hungry parents were a guaranteed and effortless transaction. Your own profound contempt for me is exactly what caused you to walk into this room completely blind. You built a 9-figure development plan on a foundation of your own staggering arrogance. The retribution I have delivered is profoundly poetic. It is not merely punitive. It is a perfect structural counterweight to their greed. They wanted to permanently erase my grandfather's legacy so they could purchase a luxury ski condo in Vail. Instead, I have legally ensured that his name and his beloved pines will remain unsellable and untouched forever, right in the exact location they tried to destroy him. The symmetry of the action clicks shut like a heavy steel lock engaging. My father's benevolent smile is completely gone. The mask of the proud patriarch has slid off, revealing the terrified features of a man who realizes he has just lost a massive financial windfall. He stares at the conservation easement, and his chest rises and falls with rapid, shallow breaths. He opens his mouth to speak, but he cannot find the words to salvage the situation. He is a man who relies on leverage, and I have just legally vaporized the only asset he thought he controlled. But as he sits there trying to calculate the social fallout of this collapsed deal, my father does not yet understand the full scope of his predicament. He thinks the conservation easement was the entirety of the trap. He believes the loss of the finder's fee is the worst thing that will happen to him tonight. He does not realize that the protected land was only the heavy door swinging shut behind him, locking him inside the room with me. Carter continues to stare at the conservation easement, his hands trembling slightly as he traces the embossed state seal. He looks up at me, and the arrogance that defined his features all evening has been entirely replaced by a desperate and uncomprehending shock. He opens his mouth to speak, but I do not give him the opportunity to interrupt the momentum of the evening. I have controlled the pacing of this interaction since I broke the seal on the envelope, and I intend to maintain that control until the very end. "But you already knew the land might be a risk, Carter," I say, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any gloating. "You are an experienced commercial developer. You knew dealing with private mountain acreage was inherently complicated. You just made a calculated bet that I would be too heartbroken and too intimidated by your presence to make it difficult for you. You assumed my lingering feelings would override my business sense. That was a phenomenally bad bet. Now I allow the second carefully loaded weapon to fire. This is the moment I address the massive structural flaw in his financial timeline, and I do it with a chilling adherence to professional ethics. I am not a vengeful ex-girlfriend acting recklessly outside the bounds of the law. I am a meticulous environmental consultant who operates strictly within the confines of corporate compliance. Operating lawfully is always colder and far more destructive than operating emotionally because it leaves the target with absolutely no avenue for an appeal. I fold my hands on top of the white linen tablecloth. My small environmental consulting firm, the one you repeatedly mocked as a hobby, was retained several months ago as the primary compliance reviewer for the regional underwriting division of Summit Peak Capital, I explain. My tone is the exact same one I used to brief a room full of municipal zoning commissioners. We were hired long before I ever knew your specific resort project was the one under their review. Summit Peak relies on our assessments to clear their high-risk mountain developments before they release major funding tranches. Carter blinks rapidly, trying to process the catastrophic collision of his professional and personal worlds. I watch the realization slowly dawn on him that the woman he discarded was secretly holding the keys to his entire financial empire. The moment I connected the geographical coordinates of your proposed Breckenridge resort to my firm's client file, I did exactly what my professional integrity required me to do. I continue ensuring my pronunciation is razor sharp. I immediately recused myself from the project in writing. I officially disclosed the conflict of interest to the Compliance Board and to Summit Peak Capital. I stepped completely away from the review process. I never laid a single finger on your specific file. My father lets out a sharp, confused breath. He is trying to understand why I am explaining corporate ethics in the middle of a family confrontation. He thinks I am confessing to a missed opportunity. He does not grasp that my recusal is the very mechanism that makes my trap inescapable. "I did not need to touch your file, Carter," I tell him, leaning forward slightly so my words land with maximum impact. The land cannot possibly pass the final environmental review because it is now a legally protected conservation easement. That is not my subjective professional opinion. It is an immutable matter of public law. No environmental consultant in the state of Colorado can authorize a heavy machinery access road through a registered perpetual trust. I reach into my leather bag one final time and retrieve a single sheet of standard printer paper. It lacks the heavy cardstock and the gold seals of the previous documents, but its contents are infinitely more destructive. I slide the paper across the table, letting it come to rest right beside the Conservation Trust Agreement. "My senior colleague signed the official denial of compliance this afternoon," I say. He processed the rejection cleanly and unchallengeably, based solely on the public filings. It is a completely airtight denial, because I made absolutely sure it could not be legally challenged by keeping my own hands completely off it. You cannot claim bias or conflict of interest, Carter. You were rejected by the book. Carter stares at the stark black and white text of the denial notice. He does not need to read the fine print to understand the magnitude of his catastrophe. Without a compliant and legally approved access route, Summit Peak Capital is legally bound by their own underwriting protocols. They cannot and will not release the second massive tranche of funding tomorrow morning. The automatic wire transfer he bragged about earlier is dead. Tomorrow morning, when the banks open and that essential funding fails to appear, your investors are going to start asking very pointed questions, I say, outlining his immediate future with clinical precision. They are going to want to know why you sold them shares in a 9-figure luxury project built on land you never owned and never bothered to legally verify. They are going to discover that you skipped the most basic due diligence because you were too arrogant to run a standard title search on your ex-girlfriend's property. Carter physically slumps in his heavy upholstered chair. The rigid and aggressive posture that defined his presence all evening simply dissolves. The overwhelming arrogance drains out of his face like water emptying from a cracked basin. The illusion of the untouchable billionaire developer shatters, leaving behind something remarkably small and terrified. He looks at the paperwork, and he knows his career in commercial real estate is effectively over. No major financial firm will ever back a developer who commits such a staggering and amateurish blunder. You are not building a mountain resort, Carter, I say, my voice dropping to a quiet and final register. You defaulted on the entire project the day you decided my grandfather's legacy was not worth a standard title search. You let your contempt for me override your business acumen, and it just cost you your empire. I glance across the table at Ashley. The dynamic between the couple has shifted so violently, it is almost palpable in the room. She has completely stopped touching his arm. The supportive and cloying girlfriend routine has vanished instantly. She looks at Carter not with sympathy, but with the cold and assessing gaze of a woman analyzing a bad investment. The illusion of the billionaire lifestyle she was boasting about just 20 minutes ago is gone. The custom home with the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the peaks will never be built. She is already doing the mental math on her exit strategy. She is calculating how quickly she can quietly leave the restaurant and distance herself from a man facing massive investor lawsuits. My father sits perfectly rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He is staring at the denial notice, and his mind is desperately trying to find a way to salvage the situation. He is a man who builds his entire identity on his proximity to wealth and power, and he has just watched his golden ticket evaporate in front of his eyes. But as devastated as he is by the loss of the finder's fee, my father still does not understand the full scope of his predicament. He still believes he is only a spectator to Carter's ruin. He does not yet realize that the avalanche I just triggered is coming for him next. Carter stares at the stark white paper of the compliance denial. His breathing is shallow and rapid, the rhythm of a man trapped in a burning building, calculating the distance to the nearest exit. I watch him closely, expecting the final collapse, expecting the angry resignation of a developer who has lost his grandest prize. But the complete capitulation I anticipated does not arrive. Instead, a subtle shift occurs in his posture. He drags his tailored linen napkin across his mouth, slowly, deliberately buying himself a crucial handful of seconds. When he lowers the napkin, the terrified amateur is gone. The aggressive, predatory developer resurfaces, replacing the panic with a cold and calculating sneer. "Cute," Carter says, his voice regaining its abrasive swagger. He leans back in his chair and crosses his arms over his chest, projecting an aura of renewed control. "It is a very cute little stunt, Harper. I will give you credit for the dramatic presentation, but your entire grand strategy relies on one massive and incredibly naive assumption. You assumed that my $50 million infrastructure plan only possessed one single viable access route." He lets out a harsh, dismissive laugh that grates against the quiet atmosphere of the private dining room. "You think a firm like mine stakes 9 figures of investor capital on a single choke point without securing a contingency plan?" he asks, shaking his head as if he is gently correcting a slow child. "I am a professional developer, Harper. I do not play games with logistics. I anticipated that we might encounter resistance from someone during the final acquisition phase. I did not expect the resistance to come from you," he admits, offering a brief, condescending nod. "I assumed we might hit a snag with some stubborn generational holdout landowner trying to extort us for a higher premium, so I took precautions." He reaches forward and casually taps the presentation folder, pushing the conservation easement slightly to the side. Months ago, my acquisitions team quietly secured a secondary option for an access corridor through the neighboring Halverson parcel. It is not the ideal path. It is significantly longer, it requires more extensive grading, and aesthetically it is much uglier than the route through your grandfather's pristine timberline, but from an engineering standpoint, it is entirely viable. We hold the exclusive option to purchase that corridor the moment we encounter a roadblock. Carter leans forward, resting his elbows on the table, and fixes me with a triumphant glare. So your little memorial easement is not the catastrophic death blow you thought it was. It is a speed bump. It is a temporary administrative hurdle. I will simply notify the engineering firm tomorrow morning. We refile the municipal zoning applications using the Halverson corridor as the primary access route. We submit the revised topography reports. The Underwriting Compliance Board reviews the new pathway. The second tranche of funding releases a few weeks late instead of never. He smiles a cold, triumphant smile. "Nice try, Harper," he says, his tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. "But you are out of your depth." For a terrifying beat, the very ground beneath my chair seems to shift and destabilize. The absolute certainty that has anchored me for the last 10 minutes suddenly wavers. My father lets out a long, shaky exhale, and I can see the desperate hope flickering back to life in his eyes. He believes the finder's fee might still be salvaged. Ashley, who had been physically distancing herself from Carter just moments ago, subtly shifts her weight back toward him. Her manicured hand drifts hesitantly toward his forearm, ready to resume the role of the supportive billionaire girlfriend if the empire is indeed secure. In this suffocating moment, I allow myself to feel a sharp and visceral spike of genuine fear. My pulse hammered against my ribs. My palms grow damp against the leather of my bag. This is the raw, unexpected emotion that validates the entire confrontation, because a victory that was never truly in doubt was never a victory at all. If there was no risk of failure, the stakes were meaningless. The reader needs to taste the metallic tang of panic right alongside me. I need to feel the terrifying possibility that Carter, with his vast resources and his relentless arrogance, might actually outmaneuver me. I need to face the chilling prospect that my grandfather's land could still be surrounded by the roar of heavy machinery and the stench of diesel exhaust. I stare at Carter, watching the smug confidence radiate from his posture. I force my racing heart to slow down. I draw a deep, stabilizing breath of the cool air circulating in the restaurant. I push the spike of fear down into a tight, manageable box. I am not the naive girl he remembers. I do not crumble when the variables change. I am a senior environmental consultant who has spent the last 7 years mapping the intricate hydrology of the High Rockies. I know the terrain better than his entire engineering firm combined. I let his triumphant smirk linger for a few seconds longer, allowing him to fully commit to his secondary plan before I dismantle it. I look at him and ask the one specific question I have been holding in reserve since he first mentioned his funding structure in Part 5. "The Halverson corridor you optioned," I say, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any tremor. "That alternative route has to cross the main artery of the creek before it connects to the highway, does it not?" Carter frowns, slightly confused by the highly technical nature of the question. The arrogant sneer falters for a fraction of a second as his mind races to review the topographical maps he paid a fortune to acquire. His jaw tightens visibly as he recalls the specific geographic layout of the neighboring parcel. "It does," I say, answering the question for him when he hesitates. I do not wait for his confirmation because I already know the geography of that mountain intimately. I have taken water samples from every bend and tributary of that specific waterway. And because I know the hydrology, Carter, I also know exactly what your contingency plan requires. I lean forward, matching his aggressive posture with a chilling stillness. The Halverson route crossing that creek means it physically intersects the exact same protected watershed that my newly registered conservation easement now legally controls the comprehensive water rights to, I explain. The legal framework of my trust is not limited to the trees and the topsoil. It governs the entire aquatic ecosystem flowing through that specific drainage basin. I watch the color begin to drain from his face once again. The realization of what I am saying is hitting him like a physical blow. You can legally purchase the dirt on the Halverson property to build your alternative road, Carter. You have the right to grade that land. What you absolutely cannot do under any circumstances is construct a commercial culvert, build a heavy load-bearing bridge, or install a commercial drainage line across a waterway that I permanently and irrevocably conserved 3 weeks ago. I let the absolute finality of that statement settle over the dining room. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the undeniable truth of the environmental regulations to crush his final desperate hope. Any structural interference with that creek requires the explicit authorization of the watershed rights holder. I say, my voice dropping to a quiet and lethal register. And the rights holder is the Colorado Land Trust, operating under the strict parameters of my grandfather's memorial easement. They will never grant you permission to bridge that creek for a commercial mega-resort. I look directly into his eyes, ensuring he understands the inescapable nature of his defeat. I did not just protect 50 acres of timberline, Carter, I tell him. I protected the water. I secured the lifeblood of that entire mountain ridge. Both of your proposed access routes die at the exact same creek. The swagger collapses entirely and permanently. The resilient developer persona shatters, leaving nothing but a devastated man staring at the ruins of his own ambition. This is the moment the true depth of the trap is revealed. The surprise of his counterpunch is instantly neutralized by the deeper realization that I was operating 3 moves ahead of the contingency plan he thought was a closely guarded corporate secret. He realizes that I did not just build a wall to stop him. I built a labyrinth designed to exhaust his resources and trap him regardless of which path he chose. Carter stares at the white tablecloth, his mouth slightly open, but unable to form a coherent sentence. He cannot argue with the hydrology, and he cannot negotiate with a perpetual conservation trust. He is completely and utterly defeated. The 9-figure project is dead, and he knows it. The funding will not release tomorrow or next month or next year. His investors will demand answers he cannot provide. Ashley withdraws her hand from his arm quickly, as if his sudden failure is a contagious disease. She grabs her small designer clutch from the back of her chair and holds it tightly in her lap. She is no longer pretending to be the supportive partner. She is a woman preparing to flee a burning building. My father slumps back in his chair, the desperate hope that flickered in his eyes completely extinguished. He looks at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I see genuine fear in his expression. He is not afraid of Carter. He is afraid of me. He is looking at the daughter he underestimated for 30 years, and he finally realizes the terrifying extent of my capabilities. But my father still believes he is only collateral damage in Carter's ruin. He still thinks the loss of the finder's fee is his punishment. He does not yet know that the true reckoning for his betrayal has not even begun. The complete and inescapable reality of Carter's structural failure hangs heavy in the private dining room. The silence is profound and thick, stretching out until it is suddenly shattered by the sharp and panicked intake of breath from across the table. My mother finally finds her voice. It is shrill and trembling, entirely stripped of the polished societal veneer she worked so hard to maintain all evening. "Harper, the finder's fee," she gasps, clutching the edge of the white tablecloth with white-knuckled desperation. Her eyes dart frantically between me and the ruined presentation folder. "You have absolutely ruined us. How could you do this to your own family?" I turn away from Carter and direct my full attention to the 2 people who raised me. The anger that had been simmering beneath my ribs for the last 2 hours cools into something remarkably steady and clear. It is the clarity of a woman who has finally recognized the true cost of her own misplaced loyalty. I am not going to unleash a barrage of screaming accusations. I am not going to threaten to seize their primary residence or leverage their home to satisfy a vindictive grudge. That kind of melodramatic financial maneuvering is a cruelty disguised as justice. It would reduce me to the exact level of ruthless exploitation they just attempted to execute against me. I am going to deliver a much quieter and far more devastating truth. I do not own your debt, Mom, I say, keeping my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable registers with absolute clarity. I did not buy your commercial loans through some shadowy blind LLC. I do not have the power to foreclose on the house you live in. My father lets out a short and shaky exhale of relief. He thinks he has escaped the worst of the financial fallout. He believes his immediate exposure is limited to the loss of the anticipated windfall from the resort deal. He adjusts his tie and attempts to regain a shred of his fractured dignity. "Well, that is something," at least he mutters, attempting a weak and patronizing smile. "We can always find another investment opportunity to recover the lost revenue." "You misunderstand the situation entirely, Dad." I continue cutting him off before he can fully assemble his new defensive narrative. "I am not your creditor. I have been your silent benefactor." I reach into my worn leather tote bag for the final time tonight. I pull out a thin manila envelope and slide it across the table until it rests directly in front of my father. I do not slide it with aggression. I slide it with the clinical precision of an auditor delivering a final and damning report. For the last 2 years, ever since my environmental consulting firm secured that massive regional compliance contract, I have been quietly subsidizing your lifestyle, I explain, watching the confusion wash over his face. You both remember when your primary business loans went into severe default 24 months ago. You remember the terrifying letters from the bank threatening to seize your remaining assets. And you both remember when that sudden and miraculous goodwill restructuring occurred, significantly lowering your mandatory monthly payments. My mother stares at me, her mouth slightly open. The color drains from her cheeks as the realization begins to take shape. You told everyone at the country club that your bank had recognized your long-standing value as clients and graciously offered you a customized relief package, I say, recalling the exact lie she peddled to her social circle. You bragged about your excellent financial standing to anyone who would listen. The bank did not restructure your debt out of the goodness of their hearts, Mom. Banks do not operate on goodwill. They operate on capital. Every single month for the last 2 years, an anonymous transfer has been covering the massive shortfall on your commercial loan obligations. That money, the capital that has kept the bank from seizing your accounts and auctioning off your lifestyle, came directly from the revenue generated by my supposedly small and insignificant firm. I watch my father open the manila envelope with trembling fingers. He pulls out the certified bank transfer records. He sees the dates, he sees the staggering dollar amounts, and he sees my name listed as the originating account holder for every single transaction. The undeniable paper trail proves that the daughter he dismissed as a failure has been the only thing standing between him and total financial ruin. I have been paying an exorbitant premium every single month to keep your life afloat, I tell them. The truth I have hidden for years finally spoken aloud in the center of this upscale restaurant. I subsidized your existence so you would never have to feel the crushing humiliation of public bankruptcy. I paid your debts so you would never have to endure the exact type of humiliating ambush you were so eager to hand me tonight. The profound tragedy of my own behavior settles over me. I recognize the immense flaw in my character that allowed this dynamic to persist for so long. I did it because I fundamentally believed that protecting you was my primary job as a daughter. I confess the vulnerability raw and unvarnished. I believed my only worth to this family lay in absorbing your problems silently, regardless of what it cost me financially or emotionally. I thought I was buying your love by shielding you from the consequences of your own reckless ambition. My parents stare at the transfer records, completely paralyzed by the revelation. They are looking at the undeniable proof of their own financial incompetence and my silent sacrifice. They cannot argue with the math, and they cannot spin the narrative to make themselves look like the victims. But here is the most crucial part of this entire evening, I say, leaning back in my chair and looking at them with a profound sense of finality. As of tomorrow morning, those automatic monthly transfers stop completely. My mother gasps, her hand flying to her mouth. "Harper, please," she whispers, her voice cracking with genuine terror. "You cannot do that. The bank will call the loans due immediately. We will lose everything. The memberships, the cars, the house. You cannot punish us like this." "I am not doing this to punish you, Mom," I reply, my voice steady and resolute. "Terminating the payments is not an act of vengeance. It is an act of extreme self-preservation. I am stopping the subsidies because I finally understand the bitter truth of our relationship." I look at the presentation folder containing the deed to my grandfather's land. I look at Carter sitting silently in his ruined arrogance. Protecting people who would willingly trade my grandfather's grave for a vacation condo is not an act of love, I tell her, the words ringing with absolute clarity. It is just fear wearing a much nicer coat. I was afraid of losing my family, so I paid to keep you comfortable. But the family I was paying for never really existed. You proved that tonight when you tried to sell me to the highest bidder. My father continues to stare blankly at the transfer records spread out before him on the white linen. He is not financially ruined by my hand. I am not seizing his assets or driving him into poverty. I am simply removing the invisible safety net I constructed beneath him. For the very first time in his adult life, my father is going to have to face the brutal and unmitigated consequences of his own financial choices. He is going to have to explain to his creditors why he can no longer afford the lifestyle he projects. The silence that follows my declaration is fundamentally different from the tense quiet that preceded it. It is not the silence of anticipation or the silence of a trap being set. It is the heavy and enduring silence of a profound realization. The illusion of their superiority has been completely dismantled. They are sitting at a luxury dining table surrounded by the wreckage of their own avarice, and they have absolutely no one to blame but themselves. I have delivered the truth, and I have reclaimed my autonomy. I do not need to linger in this room to witness the slow and agonizing process of their reckoning. The difficult and irreversible thing has been accomplished, and I am walking out of this restaurant entirely whole. My mother begins to cry. The tears spill over her carefully applied makeup, tracing dark lines down her cheeks as the reality of her impending financial exposure takes hold. Her weeping is not a calculated performance designed to manipulate my sympathies. It is a raw and visceral reaction to the sudden removal of the safety net she has unknowingly relied upon for 2 years. She covers her mouth with her trembling hands, and the sound of her muffled sobbing is the only noise in the private dining room. For the last 3 decades of my life, the sight of my mother crying would have triggered an immediate and frantic response within me. The deeply ingrained reflex to smooth over the conflict, to offer immediate reassurance, and to surrender my own needs to restore her comfort would have been overwhelming. I would have abandoned my boundaries instantly to stop her pain. But tonight, sitting in this heavy upholstered chair, I do not flinch from her tears. I also do not dissolve into them. I observe her distress with a profound and steady compassion, but I refuse to absorb the responsibility for causing it. The suffering she is experiencing right now is the direct and unavoidable consequence of her own choices. I cannot shield her from the fallout of attempting to sell my inheritance without actively participating in my own destruction. I lean forward slightly and address her directly, ensuring my tone is steady and devoid of any lingering hostility. "I am not doing this to hurt you, Mom," I say, my voice calm and grounded. "Terminating the financial subsidies is not a vindictive punishment for what you tried to do here tonight. I am doing this because I am finally prioritizing my own survival. I want a mother. I desperately wanted a family that valued me for who I am. What I do not want, and what I will no longer tolerate, is acting as a creditor for my own dignity." I watch her eyes dart toward the scattered transfer records and then back to my face. She is searching for a sign of hesitation, for a sliver of the obedient daughter she remembers. She finds only resolute calm. If you and Dad ever reach a point where you decide you would genuinely rather have a daughter than maintain your position in a superficial status circle, you know exactly where to find me, I tell her, offering the only olive branch I can afford to extend. The door to a real relationship is open, but I am fundamentally changing the terms of entry. I am no longer paying the price of admission to sit at your table. You cannot buy my loyalty, and you can no longer leverage my desire for your affection to fund your lifestyle. If we are going to be a family, it has to be based on mutual respect, not financial extortion. I turn my gaze away from my parents and look across the table at Carter. I have absolutely nothing left to say to the man who broke my heart 2 years ago and attempted to steal my grandfather's legacy tonight. There is no need for a final cutting remark or a dramatic parting shot. His punishment is already unfolding in real time. His sleek smartphone resting near his water glass illuminates with an incoming call. The name flashing on the screen belongs to a senior partner at the investment firm he was boasting about an hour ago. The news of the environmental compliance denial has clearly reached the underwriting department, and the frantic inquiries have begun. The phone buzzes insistently, demanding an explanation he cannot provide. The destruction of his massive commercial real estate venture is entirely self-inflicted. It is lawful, and it is deeply deserved. Ashley has quietly and efficiently gathered her expensive cashmere coat from the back of her chair. She avoids making eye contact with anyone at the table as she slips her arms into the sleeves. She is meticulously executing her exit strategy, distancing herself from the impending wreckage of Carter's professional life before the collateral damage can tarnish her own reputation. She arrived expecting to celebrate a major financial triumph, and she is leaving a sinking ship. Sitting in the dim light of the restaurant, I finally feel the specific sensation I came here uncertain I could ever achieve. It is not the thrilling rush of a victorious triumph. The reality of severing financial and emotional ties with my family is too heavy for unadulterated joy. What I feel instead is a profound and unburdening release. The crushing weight of the lie I have carried for my entire adult life, the belief that I must protect my family at the cost of my own identity, has been permanently lifted from my shoulders. I look at the small worn envelope sitting on the white linen tablecloth. It rests exactly halfway between Carter's ruined presentation folder and the untouched designer pen. My grandfather's handwritten letter, the single line of Spanish that anchored my resolve, remains the most valuable object in the room. I reach out and pick up the envelope, gently sliding it back into my leather tote bag. That letter stays with me. It is a tangible reminder of the man who taught me the true value of the land and the enduring strength required to protect it. The emotional resolution of this grueling evening has been achieved. I have secured my external goal. The 50 acres of pristine High Rockies timberline are legally protected by a perpetual conservation easement, ensuring my grandfather's legacy will never be paved over for a luxury resort. More importantly, I have secured my internal goal. I have successfully broken the toxic cycle of buying conditional love through silent self-sacrifice. But this victory carries a very real and significant price. The cost of protecting the land and reclaiming my autonomy is the loss of my parents, at least for the foreseeable future. I am walking out of this restaurant as a woman who is essentially motherless by her own conscious choice. The win has a profound weight because the sacrifice is genuine. I am not walking away into a perfect fairy tale ending. I am walking away into a complicated and lonely reality, but it is a reality built on a foundation of absolute truth, rather than a fragile scaffolding of lies. I push my chair back from the table and stand up. I smooth the front of my sensible wool sweater, the very garment Ashley mocked earlier this evening. I do not make a grand final speech to the silent room. I do not offer any dramatic concluding remarks to ensure they understand the magnitude of their failure. There is absolutely nothing left to prove to the people sitting at this table, and more importantly, there is nothing left to prove to myself. The facts have been presented, the boundaries have been established, and the consequences are already in motion. The tense silence in the private dining room is broken only by the persistent buzzing of Carter's smartphone as his investors continue to demand answers he cannot give. My father remains paralyzed, staring at the financial records that spell the end of his curated lifestyle. My mother continues to weep quietly, her face buried in her hands. I adjust the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder and prepare to walk toward the heavy oak door. I have navigated the ambush, dismantled the trap, and reclaimed my future. The difficult and irreversible thing has been accomplished. But before I take my final steps out of the room, the waiter approaches the table carrying a small silver tray that holds the leather-bound checkbook. The final piece of the evening's business has arrived, and it requires immediate attention. The heavy oak door glides open one last time. The sommelier steps into the suffocating atmosphere of the private dining room. He carries a polished silver tray holding a slender black leather folder. He moves with the practiced discretion of a man who has witnessed countless business deals collapse and marriages end over the dessert course. He does not linger on the sight of my mother wiping her ruined makeup with a linen napkin, or Carter staring blankly at the dark screen of his silenced phone. The sommelier approaches the center of the table, places the tray near the decanter of Bordeaux, and quietly retreats into the main restaurant, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I look at the crystal decanter resting near the floral centerpiece. The dark ruby liquid inside has been breathing for the past hour, opening up and releasing the scent of old oak and damp earth into the enclosed space. When I ordered that specific bottle earlier this evening, my mother assumed it was a white flag signaling my defeat. Carter assumed it was a reckless display of new money from a woman trying to prove she belonged in his tax bracket. They were both wrong. The staggering price tag on that menu was always irrelevant to me. What mattered was the vintage. The year printed on the label was 2010. That was the exact year my grandfather took me up the rugged mountain trail behind his cabin. We stood in the biting wind of a high-altitude winter, and he taught me how to care for the fragile ecosystem hidden beneath the snowpack. He knelt in the freezing mud and showed me how to read the health of the timberline and how to trace the hidden pathways of the underground aquifers. He did not leave me a liquid estate to fund a lavish lifestyle. He left me a sanctuary to steward. Ordering that wine was never a hollow stunt meant to intimidate the people sitting at this table. It was a private ceremony. It was a silent homage to the only man in my lineage who understood that deep roots are infinitely more valuable than superficial appearances. I reach across the white tablecloth and pick up the black leather folder. The material is cool and smooth under my fingertips. I open the cover and glance at the printed receipt. The total reflects the extravagant artisan appetizers, the imported sparkling water, the customized main courses nobody managed to finish, and the cost of the vintage Bordeaux. It is a very heavy sum. In the original version of this confrontation, I might have felt a vindictive urge to use my corporate accounts to freeze my ex-fiance credit cards or orchestrate some convoluted financial ruin. I might have tried to match their calculated cruelty with a spectacular display of monetary dominance. But true justice does not require theatrical revenge or chaotic retribution. True justice requires holding people accountable to the exact words they speak. I close the leather folder. I look at my father. He is still staring at the printed bank transfer records that outline the sudden and permanent end of his curated lifestyle. His shoulders are slumped, and the tailored lines of his expensive suit suddenly look too large for his deflated frame. Earlier this evening, when the room was still buzzing with the anticipated thrill of a lucrative real estate acquisition, Diego leaned back in his chair and made a grand, booming declaration. He spread his arms wide and announced to the entire table that he would be the one to host this gathering. He declared it was his treat to celebrate the impending partnership. He wanted Carter to see him as a generous benefactor and a wealthy peer. He wanted to claim ownership of the victory before the ink was even dry on the contract. I slide the leather folder across the smooth linen surface. I guide it past the empty water glasses and the untouched Wagyu beef tartare until it comes to rest directly in front of my father. It bumps gently against his wrist. "You offered to host tonight, Dad," I say, keeping my voice calm and relentlessly steady. "You said it was your treat to celebrate the new partnership. I will hold you to that promise." My father looks down at the black leather. He slowly opens the cover, and his eyes lock onto the final total. The blood drains from his face for a second time tonight. He is looking at a bill for thousands of dollars. It is an astronomical expense for a man who has just been informed that his monthly financial safety net has been permanently severed. He came to this restaurant intending to trade his father-in-law's legacy for a mountain condo and a lucrative finder's fee. Instead, he is going to reach into his own dwindling bank account to pay for the exact vintage that honors the man he tried to erase. The poetic symmetry of the transaction is flawless. He must personally finance the dinner where his own greed dismantled his future. I let my father sit with the heavy reality of his tab. I turn my attention back to the crystal glass resting near my plate. I reach out and wrap my fingers around the delicate stem. I lift the glass, holding it up, so the flickering candlelight catches the deep red hues of the wine. It is the very first time I have raised a glass all evening. I do not look at Carter or Ashley. I do not look at my weeping mother. I look straight ahead into the empty space of the room, focusing my mind on the memory of the freezing wind and the smell of the pine trees. I speak softly, allowing the natural cadence of the language to carry the profound weight of the moment. La tierra se cuida. The land is cared for. I translate the phrase quietly, ensuring the English words echo in the silent dining room. It is a toast delivered over the wreckage of the people who attempted to sell my grandfather for spare parts. I am honoring the vow I made to him in the snow all those years ago. I kept the soil safe. I kept the water pure. I kept his name anchored to the mountain ridge where it belongs. I did not allow his history to become a casualty of their ambition. I did not let them pave over the woods he loved. I look at the rim of the crystal glass. The dark wine smells rich and inviting, but I do not bring the rim to my lips. I do not take a single sip. I lower my arm and set the glass back down on the tablecloth, leaving it entirely full. Leaving the wine untouched is the final and most crucial act of my independence. I do not need the alcohol to numb the residual sting of their betrayal. I do not need to consume the luxury to prove that I am worthy of sitting in this upscale establishment. The wine served its purpose the moment the sommelier uncorked the bottle and poured the dark liquid into the crystal decanter. I only needed to prove to myself that I could command this room, order the tribute my grandfather deserved, sit at a table surrounded by my greatest insecurities, and walk away completely unbought. Every loaded element of this evening has fired with perfect precision. The vintage, the staggering price tag, the handwritten letter, and the spoken language have all landed on the exact same resonant note. Nothing in this room was mere decoration. The foundation has been secured, and the emotional ledger has been balanced. The people sitting across from me are finally facing the consequences of treating affection as a transactional currency. I take a slow, deep breath of the air circulating through the private dining room. The heavy atmosphere of expectation and manipulation has dissipated entirely. I am ready to stand up and leave this chapter of my life behind. I do not wait for my father to peel back the black leather cover of the check folder to scrutinize the staggering total. I do not wait to hear the panicked tone of Carter's voice when he finally answers the next frantic incoming call from his rapidly dissolving investment board. I do not wait for Ashley to finish fastening the expensive buttons of her cashmere coat and execute her silent retreat from the sinking ship. I do not wait for my mother's muffled weeping to escalate into a desperate apology or sharpen into a bitter accusation. For the entirety of my adult life, I have operated on a specific and highly damaging reflex. I was conditioned to always linger in the tense aftermath of family conflicts. I was trained to monitor their facial expressions and gauge the temperature of the room, waiting for a cue that would tell me how to feel or what to say next. I believed that analyzing their reactions was my inherent responsibility. I thought staying engaged until the tension smoothed over was the only way to earn my place at their table. Tonight, I have definitively unlearned that crippling habit. Waiting for their validation is the lie that kept me captive, and I am permanently done with it. I place my hands flat on the white linen tablecloth and push myself upward. The heavy wooden legs of my upholstered chair scrape softly against the carpet, breaking the heavy silence that blankets our corner of the private dining room. I stand tall and adjust the collar of my sensible wool sweater. I reach down and pick up my worn leather tote bag, ensuring the small flap is securely fastened over my grandfather's handwritten letter. The letter is safe inside, and so am I. I turn away from the table. The sprawling main dining room of the upscale restaurant stretches out before me. Just an hour ago, the neighboring patrons paused their elegant conversations to witness my father's booming and triumphant toast. They watched a patriarch raise his crystal glass to celebrate a lucrative family partnership. Now those same patrons sit in muted curiosity as they watch me navigate the space between the tables. They observe my quiet and solitary departure. They can sense the sudden and drastic drop in atmospheric pressure, but they will never know the specific details of the implosion that just occurred in the private room. I maintain a steady and unhurried pace as I cross the carpeted floor. It is crucial that I keep this departure entirely restrained. There is a strong and primal temptation to turn around and deliver one final cutting remark to ensure they truly comprehend the magnitude of their failure. There is an urge to pause at the threshold and offer a dramatic parting shot that would leave a lasting sting, but I resist that theatrical impulse. The true power of a successful walkout resides entirely in what is left unsaid. Adding a gloating flourish would only diminish the clean severity of the boundaries I just established. I do not offer a backward glance for cinematic effect. I do not slam the heavy oak door. I simply keep walking forward, putting physical distance between myself and the wreckage of their ambition. As I approach the entryway of the restaurant, the heavy double glass doors come into view. Even before I reach the polished metal handles, I can feel the aggressive Denver winter pushing against the seals. The bitter cold drafts seep through the gaps, carrying the sharp and bracing scent of impending snow. The freezing air feels incredibly clean. It is a stark and welcome contrast to the cloying perfume and suffocating tension that dominated the dining room. Behind me sits the complete collapse of a 9-figure commercial real estate venture. Behind me sits a devastating financial bill that must be settled by a man who can no longer afford his own lifestyle. Behind me sit 4 adults who are currently learning in real time that the woman they confidently priced as a pliable pawn had quietly evolved into the only actual adult at the table. They built their plans on the assumption that my obedience was guaranteed, and they are now choking on the dust of their own miscalculations. I step through the vestibule and push the heavy outer door open. The freezing wind immediately hits my face, stinging my cheeks and snapping my focus to the present moment. The valet stand is empty, and the parking lot is dark and slick with patches of black ice. The street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. Nobody chases me out into the cold. There are no frantic footsteps echoing behind me on the concrete. There is no shouted apology echoing across the frozen asphalt, begging me to come back inside and reconsider my terms. They do not follow me because they do not yet possess the capacity to understand the true nature of what they have lost tonight. Their immediate panic is entirely focused on the failed resort deal, the frozen bank accounts, and the massive dinner tab. They are mourning the loss of their financial leverage and their social capital. They do not yet realize that they have also permanently lost me. The profound realization that their daughter is gone, and that the quiet, reliable shield they always took for granted has been permanently removed, will not hit them until much later. That deep and aching comprehension will arrive in the quiet moments of the weeks to come when they reach for a safety net that is no longer there. That is exactly where that specific understanding should arrive. It belongs in the quiet aftermath, not in the chaotic heat of the confrontation. I walk across the icy parking lot toward my car. My boots crunch softly against the frozen pavement. As I dig my keys out of my pocket, I allow myself to register the one honest and unvarnished interior note of the evening. It is a complex and heavily braided sensation. I feel a profound and undeniable sense of relief. I am finally free from the crushing weight of their expectations and the toxic cycle of conditional approval. The oppressive architecture of my childhood has been dismantled, and I am standing in the open air. But tightly threaded through that liberating relief is a sharp and undeniable grief. I am free, and I am also motherless by my own conscious choice tonight. I have actively severed the ties to the people who raised me because staying connected to them required the active erasure of my own identity. Both of these truths exist simultaneously within my chest. It is not a clean and euphoric high. It is the heavy, messy, and deeply real emotion a person actually feels when they have just walked out of the hardest and most consequential room of their entire life. The victory is authentic, but the collateral damage is immense. I reach my car and unlock the door. The interior is freezing, but I do not immediately turn the key in the ignition. I slide into the driver's seat and pull the heavy door shut. The door swings on its slow, deliberate hinges and latches with a firm and solid thud, sealing me inside the quiet cabin. The sound of the latch engaging feels like the final punctuation mark on a very long and very exhausting chapter. I sit in the dark and let the profound stillness of the car wash over me. The engine remains silent, and I am finally completely alone. The aftermath does not arrive with cinematic explosions or sensational front-page headlines. It trickles into my life through the mundane channels of corporate bureaucracy and quiet local rumors. 2 months after the tense birthday dinner, I am sitting at my office desk reviewing a routine batch of regional trade filings. The Municipal Zoning Board formally rejects the secondary access corridor through the neighboring Halverson parcel. Carter attempts to appeal the decision, but the hydrology reports are undeniable and legally binding. The proposed access road must bridge the protected watershed, and the Conservation Trust strictly prohibits any commercial interference with the aquatic ecosystem. The institutional investors do not wait for a second desperate appeal. The mezzanine capital firm formally withdraws their financial backing and issues a public notice severing all ties with his development group. Within 8 weeks, his luxury real estate firm files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. I learn all of this secondhand through dry legal documents and industry newsletters. I do not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy reading the sterile bankruptcy filings. There is no triumphant satisfaction in watching a man lose his professional empire. Ashley packs her expensive bags and leaves him long before the final liquidation papers are signed by the federal judge. I do not view her rapid departure as an act of cosmic karma. It is simply the inevitable trajectory of a man who built his entire life assigning value to the wrong things and the women who only stick around when the financial ledger is overflowing. He crafted a life based entirely on social leverage and predatory acquisitions. When that leverage disappeared, he was left standing in an empty room with nothing but his own hollow ambition. The consequences for my parents unfold with the same quiet and brutal efficiency. I did not take their primary residence. I never intended to foreclose on the historic house I grew up in because performing an act of retaliatory cruelty would only serve to poison my own conscience. But the sudden absence of my monthly financial subsidy forces a harsh and unavoidable economic reckoning. Without my hidden capital smoothing over their severe commercial debts, they can no longer maintain the elaborate illusion of extreme wealth. The exclusive country club memberships are quietly canceled to stop the bleeding. The lavish weekend trips to Aspen and the premium ski passes cease entirely. They can no longer afford the exorbitant property taxes and the staggering maintenance costs on their sprawling suburban estate. I hear through the local environmental consulting grapevine that they put the large house on the open market shortly after the new year. They sell the pristine facade they worked so hard to curate for decades, and they move into a much smaller and unassuming residence in a quiet municipal district. They are effectively cut off from the elite social orbit they spent their entire adult lives trying to impress. Hearing about their drastic and humiliating downsizing does not make me smile. It does not feel like a righteous victory parade. It feels like a dull and muted grief with all the sharp edges filed down. I sit with the profound ambiguity of their situation. They are finally facing the unmitigated reality of their own choices, and I am learning to exist in a world where I am no longer responsible for cushioning their fall. I do not reach out to rescue them. The only clean and uncomplicated victory in this entire ordeal exists 50 miles away in the high elevation of the Rocky Mountains. The 50 acres of rugged timberline stand entirely untouched by human greed and commercial exploitation. The heavy winter snowpack slowly melts into the spring thaw, feeding the protected creek without the toxic chemical runoff of heavy construction. The ancient pines continue to grow deep roots into the iron-rich soil. My grandfather's name sits proudly on the public municipal registry, designating the land as a permanent and unalterable conservation easement. The terrain is safe in perpetuity. No diesel bulldozer will ever crack that earth. No luxury hospitality resort will ever block the breathtaking view of the valley below. It is the one pure and unblemished win that I allow myself to keep and cherish. I visit the parcel when the harsh winter weather breaks, walking the familiar trails and breathing in the sharp scent of crushed pine needles. The land feels fundamentally different now. It feels deeply secure. It is no longer a vulnerable asset waiting to be plundered. It is a living monument to the man who taught me how to respect the ground beneath my feet. The silence from my family lasts through the bitter winter months. It is a heavy and defining silence that confirms everything I learned at the restaurant table. They are too proud to admit their devastating miscalculation, and I am too tired to prompt them. Then on a mild Tuesday in early spring, my phone illuminates on my kitchen counter. It is a text message from my mother. It is the very first direct communication I have received since I walked out the heavy glass doors of the private dining room. The message does not contain a frantic and tearful apology. It does not offer a desperate plea for forgiveness or a demanding request for financial reconciliation. It consists of 2 brief and measured sentences. I read about the land trust in the county public records. Your grandfather would be very proud of you. I stare at the glowing screen for a long time, tracing the shape of the digital letters. It is a profound and startling shift in her usual rhetoric. There is no subtle manipulation hidden within the words. There is no guilt trip designed to reel me back into her orbit. It is simply a quiet acknowledgement of a reality she can no longer control or manipulate. I do not type a reply. I leave the message unanswered on my phone. The door to a future relationship remains cracked open, but I am no longer standing in the threshold handing out free tickets. I am willing to have a mother, but I am no longer willing to pay an emotional toll to keep her around. She knows exactly where to find me when she is ready to walk through that door empty-handed. My life moves forward with a steady and predictable rhythm. I still run my environmental consulting firm out of the small brick office near the foothills. I still wake up long before dawn to drive out into the freezing mountain air and take soil samples with my own 2 hands. The work is physically demanding and frequently exhausting, but it belongs entirely to me. I have stopped trying to mold myself into a shape that pleases people who only measure my worth by my utility. I no longer answer phone calls from anyone who values me solely for the financial leverage I can provide or the legal documents I am willing to sign. My days are filled with the quiet satisfaction of a balanced professional ledger and a remarkably clear conscience. I have learned that the highest form of self-respect is simply refusing to participate in a transaction that requires the sacrifice of my own identity. I am the sole architect of my own peace, and the foundation is finally solid enough to support me. I sit at my desk and look out the window at the distant mountain peaks. The air in my office is quiet and calm. I do not check my phone waiting for the next crisis to solve. I review a new set of topographical maps preparing for the next project. The trauma of the past is fading into a manageable scar, and the future looks incredibly bright. The aftermath of that freezing November evening does not arrive with cinematic explosions or sensational front-page headlines. It trickles into my reality through the mundane channels of corporate bureaucracy and quiet local rumors. It takes approximately 8 weeks for the inevitable collapse to become a matter of public record. I do not receive a dramatic phone call begging for salvation, and I do not witness a theatrical meltdown in a corporate lobby. I learn about the total disintegration of Carter's commercial real estate firm the exact same way I learn about routine municipal infrastructure updates. I read about it in a dry and sterile commercial trade filing while drinking my morning coffee. His secondary access route died exactly where I told him it would die. The proposed pathway halted permanently at the edge of the protected watershed. The engineering firm he hired could not bypass the creek without triggering severe federal environmental violations and invalidating their entire municipal zoning application. When the unresolvable delay became common knowledge, his primary institutional investors panicked. They immediately pulled their mezzanine funding, citing a catastrophic failure of basic due diligence. His firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection within 2 months of that disastrous dinner. I do not feel any vindictive joy reading the sterile legal documents. There is no triumphant satisfaction in watching a man lose his professional empire. I learned that Ashley packed her expensive designer bags and left him long before the final liquidation papers were signed by a federal judge. I do not view her rapid departure as a satisfying act of cosmic karma. It is simply the inevitable trajectory of a man who built his entire existence assigning value to the wrong things and relying on partners who only stick around when the financial ledger is overflowing. He crafted a life based entirely on social leverage and predatory acquisitions. When that leverage disappeared, he was left standing in an empty room with nothing but his own hollow ambition. I actively resist the urge to narrate his downfall as some righteous universe balancing the scales of justice. It is just math and logical consequences playing out in real time. The consequences for my parents unfold with the same quiet and brutal efficiency. I did not take their primary residence. I never intended to foreclose on the historic house I grew up in because performing an act of retaliatory cruelty would only serve to poison my own conscience and validate their worst accusations against me. But the sudden absence of my monthly financial subsidy forces a harsh and unavoidable economic reckoning. Without my hidden capital smoothing over their severe commercial debts, they can no longer maintain the elaborate illusion of extreme wealth. The exclusive country club memberships are quietly canceled to stop the financial bleeding. The lavish weekend trips to Aspen and the premium ski passes cease entirely. They can no longer afford the exorbitant property taxes and the staggering maintenance costs on their sprawling suburban estate. I hear through the local environmental consulting grapevine that they put the large house on the open market shortly after the new year begins. They sell the pristine facade they worked so hard to curate for decades, and they move into a much smaller and unassuming residence in a quiet municipal district. They are effectively cut off from the elite social orbit they spent their entire adult lives trying to impress and infiltrate. Hearing about their drastic and humiliating downsizing does not make me smile. It does not feel like a righteous victory parade or a moment to celebrate. It feels like a dull and muted grief with all the sharp edges filed down. I sit with the profound ambiguity of their situation. I let the messy reality of their isolation exist without trying to resolve it into a neat and tidy moral lesson for my own comfort. They are finally facing the unmitigated reality of their own financial choices, and I am learning to exist in a world where I am no longer responsible for cushioning their fall. I do not reach out to rescue them from the bed they made. The only clean and uncomplicated victory in this entire ordeal exists 50 miles away in the high elevation of the Rocky Mountains. The 50 acres of rugged timberline stand entirely untouched by human greed and commercial exploitation. The heavy winter snowpack slowly melts into the spring thaw, feeding the protected creek without the toxic chemical runoff of heavy construction vehicles. The ancient pines continue to grow deep roots into the iron-rich soil undisturbed and wild. My grandfather's name sits proudly on the public municipal registry, designating the land as a permanent and unalterable conservation easement. The terrain is safe in perpetuity. No diesel bulldozer will ever crack that earth. No luxury hospitality resort will ever block the breathtaking view of the valley below. It is the one pure and unblemished win that I allow myself to keep and cherish deeply. I visit the parcel when the harsh winter weather breaks, walking the familiar trails and breathing in the sharp scent of crushed pine needles. The land feels fundamentally different to me now. It feels deeply secure. It is no longer a vulnerable asset waiting to be plundered by opportunists. It is a living monument to the man who taught me how to respect the ground beneath my feet. The silence from my family lasts through the bitter winter months. It is a heavy and defining silence that confirms everything I learned at the restaurant table. They are too proud to admit their devastating miscalculation, and I am too tired to prompt them into a conversation they are not ready to have. Then, on a mild Tuesday in early spring, my phone illuminates on my kitchen counter. It is a text message from my mother. It is the very first direct communication I have received since I walked out the heavy glass doors of the private dining room. The message does not contain a frantic and tearful apology. It does not offer a desperate plea for forgiveness or a demanding request for financial reconciliation. It consists of 2 brief and measured sentences. I read about the land trust in the county public records. Your grandfather would be very proud of you. I stare at the glowing screen for a long time, tracing the shape of the digital letters with my eyes. It is a profound and startling shift in her usual rhetoric. There is no subtle manipulation hidden within the words. There is no guilt trip designed to reel me back into her orbit or make me feel responsible for her diminished circumstances. It is simply a quiet acknowledgement of a reality she can no longer control or manipulate. I do not type a reply. I leave the message unanswered on my phone. The door to a future relationship remains cracked open, but I am no longer standing in the threshold handing out free tickets for admission. I am willing to have a mother, but I am no longer willing to pay an emotional or financial toll to keep her around. She knows exactly where to find me when she is ready to walk through that door empty-handed and honest. My life moves forward with a steady and predictable rhythm. I still run my environmental consulting firm out of the small brick office near the foothills. I still wake up long before dawn to drive out into the freezing mountain air and take soil samples with my own two hands. The work is physically demanding and frequently exhausting, but it belongs entirely and unequivocally to me. I have stopped trying to mold myself into a shape that pleases people who only measure my worth by my utility to their ambitions. I no longer answer phone calls from anyone who values me solely for the financial leverage I can provide or the legal documents I am willing to sign. My days are filled with the quiet satisfaction of a balanced professional ledger and a remarkably clear conscience. The frantic need to be the silent protector has been replaced by a grounded certainty in my own capabilities. I sit at my desk and look out the window at the distant mountain peaks. The air in my office is calm, and the future looks remarkably open. Exactly 1 year has passed since I walked through the heavy glass doors of that upscale Denver restaurant. The calendar has turned a full circle and brought me right back to the first hard freeze of November. The biting winter air sweeps down from the Continental Divide just as it did 12 months ago. But today I am not navigating icy city streets in a state of quiet dread. I am not driving toward a catered ambush or a table full of people waiting to appraise my compliance. I am driving my reliable field truck up the winding access roads of the high Rockies. The heater hums a steady rhythm against the freezing mountain temperature outside my windshield. I pull the truck onto the gravel shoulder at the edge of the property boundary. The engine cuts out, and the profound silence of the high elevation settles around me. I step out of the warm cabin and my boots crunch heavily into the fresh layer of snow that blankets the ground. The freezing wind immediately hits my face. It is the exact same biting air I breathed outside the restaurant, but the person pulling it into her lungs has fundamentally changed. I zip my insulated work jacket and walk toward the entrance of the 50 acres. At the trailhead, resting quietly at the base of an ancient spruce, sits a small and unassuming bronze marker, securely embedded in a slab of native river stone. It does not boast a corporate logo or advertise a luxury brand. It simply displays the legal name of the Perpetual Conservation Trust and a brief dedication to my grandfather. His name is etched permanently into the metal, catching the pale morning light. This marker guarantees that his legacy will remain anchored to this mountain ridge forever. No heavy machinery will ever tear through this soil. No paving crew will ever silence the rush of the creek. I walk past the marker and venture deeper into the timberline. The towering pine trees my grandfather planted decades ago are visibly taller and thicker. Their heavy dark green branches sag slightly under the weight of the fresh snowpack. They stand like silent sentinels, guarding the protected watershed that gives life to this entire valley. I make my way toward a familiar clearing near the center of the parcel. This is the exact spot where he brought me when I was just a child. I drop to my knees in the snow. I do not wear gloves. I need to feel the temperature and the texture of the earth exactly the way he taught me. I plunge my bare hands deep into the freezing topsoil, brushing aside the crystalline layers of ice to reach the dark loam underneath. The cold bites sharply into my skin, but I welcome the sensation. I bring a handful of the damp earth up toward my face and breathe in the rich, complex aroma of crushed pine needles, decaying leaves, and heavy iron deposits. It smells like endurance. It smells like permanence. As I hold the freezing dirt in my palms, I think about the woman who walked into that private dining room exactly 1 year ago. Underneath all her meticulous preparation and her gathered legal documents, she was still secretly waiting to be told she possessed some inherent value. She was still hoping that by executing the perfect defensive strategy, her parents might finally recognize her worth and choose her over their social ambitions. She carried her grandfather's sealed letter in her leather bag like a heavy talisman because she needed his voice to borrow the courage she lacked. The woman kneeling in the snow today does not need to borrow courage from anyone. She already knows her own worth, and she no longer requires a panel of judges to confirm it. I do not need to deliver a triumphant speech about revenge to the empty forest. I do not need to gloat over the financial ruin of a billionaire developer or the social exile of my status-obsessed parents. The quiet majesty of this preserved landscape carries the entire weight of the victory. The undeniable reality of these 50 untouched acres is the only statement I will ever need to make. If there is a final lesson to be extracted from this entire ordeal, I choose to let my grandfather say it instead of me. I look down at the dark soil resting in my hands. I gently place the earth back into the shallow depression I dug. I carefully pack the loose snow back over the spot, ensuring the ground is left exactly as I found it. I brush the remnants of the dirt from my cold fingers, and I speak his words aloud into the freezing mountain air. La tierra no se vende, se cuida. The land is not sold, it is cared for. The fundamental wisdom of that single sentence resonates through the quiet clearing. You do not sell the things you genuinely love. You do not trade them for temporary comfort or superficial social leverage. You protect them and you care for them relentlessly. I spent 7 years believing that lesson only applied to the physical acreage of this mountain ridge. It took a devastating betrayal at a birthday dinner for me to realize that his wisdom was infinitely broader. It turns out the directive to protect what you love also applies to your own soul. You do not sell your dignity for conditional affection. You care for your own boundaries, and you protect your own peace. I push myself up from the frozen ground. I brush the clinging snow off the knees of my heavy work pants. I stand perfectly still and look out over the vast expanse of the protected valley. The sheer scale of the 50 acres stretches out before me, rolling down toward the pristine creek that saved everything. This land will outlast Carter and his hollow corporate empire. It will outlast my parents and their desperate dreams of a luxury condominium in Vail. And it will probably outlast me. It will remain a wild and uncompromised sanctuary long after my own story concludes. More importantly, this land has already outlasted the frightened and compliant version of myself that would have surrendered it. The girl who would have traded this magnificent forest for a seat at a toxic table is gone. She has been permanently replaced by a woman who understands that true belonging requires no admission fee. I do not need to invite pain into my life just to prove I am strong enough to survive it. I can simply choose to remain in the spaces where I am inherently valued. I turn around and begin the short walk back to my truck. The freezing wind whips through the branches above me, sending a fine mist of snow drifting down through the air. The story closes on the exact same cold Denver weather it opened in, but the person breathing it has fundamentally and permanently changed. That is the entire point of the journey. The victory is not simply that the villains lost their investments and their social standing. The true victory is that I finally stopped losing myself. I reach my vehicle and open the door. I leave behind no lingering questions and no dramatic invitations for an audience to weigh in on my choices. There is just the land, the memory of a handwritten letter, and a woman who successfully kept both.